80% of Russia's people farmed the land in 1917. Within a generation, forced industrialization turned that agrarian world into a nuclear superpower at terrible human cost. The official story credits central planning, iron will, and immense factories. But beneath the rapid rise, there were distortions, inefficiencies, and crushing sacrifices that planted the seeds of inevitable collapse. How did a nation transform itself so quickly, only to unravel from the inside? This is the real story behind the rise and fall of an empire that tried to plan prosperity. In 1921, Russia's cities and countryside lay in ruins. Years of war and revolution had shattered the economy. Factories stood idle, and famine stalked the villages. Lenin, facing collapse, introduced the new economic policy, known as the NEP. For the first time since the Bolshevik Revolution, peasants could sell grain on open markets. Small businesses reopened. State factories focused on essentials, while private traders, the so-called NEP men, filled gaps in supply. The results were immediate. By the mid-1920s, grain harvests and industrial output climbed back toward pre-war levels. Markets buzzed with activity, and food returned to city tables. But this recovery came with a price. The countryside remained dominant. 80% of the population still farmed the land. Peasants, newly empowered, held back grain in hopes of better prices. Urban workers, promised a socialist future, watched as private trade flourished. Inside the Communist Party, doubts grew. Many leaders saw the NEP as a retreat, a necessary pause, but not a permanent solution. Lenin himself, in his final years, warned that the state must eventually regain control. He called for electrification, new industry, and a planned economy to lift Russia out of backwardness. By 1928, the debate was over. Stalin and his allies declared the NEP finished. The state would direct all economic life. Gosplan, the state planning committee, received orders to draft a bold new blueprint. The first 5-year plan would mobilize the nation's resources for rapid industrialization. Private markets faded. Grain would be requisitioned, not bargained for. Factories would work to quotas, not profit. The dream was clear: transform a land of peasants into a modern industrial power, no matter the cost. The era of improvisation had ended. The age of command had begun. Steel poured from new mills in the Urals and Siberia, the product of round-the-clock shifts and relentless quotas. In just 4 years, Soviet steel output jumped from 4 million to nearly 6 million tons. Factories like Magnitogorsk rose almost overnight, swallowing up forests and villages as 250,000 workers laid tracks, poured concrete, and braved freezing winds. The city population swelled. By 1939, a third of all Soviets lived in towns, up from less than a fifth a decade earlier. Chimneys smoked and sirens blared, signaling an age of machines and ambition, but the cost was staggering. In the countryside, collectivization swept millions into state-run farms. Peasants lost their land, their livestock, and any control over their harvest. The state set impossible grain quotas, seizing food to feed the cities and fund new factories. When the harvests failed, hunger followed. In Ukraine, the North Caucasus, and the Volga, entire villages withered away. The famine of 1932 and 1933 killed millions. Historians estimate between 3 and 7 million people died, most in Ukraine's Black Earth Belt. Grain exports continued even as the countryside starved, paying for tractors and turbines. Inside the cities, life was harsh but hopeful. Workers flooded into new apartment blocks, their lives measured by the 5-year plan's ticking clock. For many, the promise of a modern future outweighed the hardship. Posters proclaimed progress, and the state celebrated every new smokestack. Yet beneath the surface, cracks began to show. Quotas pressed managers to inflate numbers. Factories hit targets in tons, not in quality. The countryside, stripped bare, could not keep pace. The Soviet Union had leapt forward, but the human toll and mounting strain set the stage for deeper troubles to come. Gosplan's planners worked with a single overriding command: fulfill the plan. Every year, targets for coal, steel, tractors, and thousands of other goods flowed down from Moscow through ministries to factories and farms. These targets were not just suggestions, they were law. Each enterprise received quotas measured in tons, meters, or units, and success or failure meant bonuses, demotion, or worse. But the numbers themselves often bore little relation to reality. Prices were set centrally, not by supply and demand, but by committee. A ton of nails counted the same whether made of sturdy steel or brittle scrap. Managers, desperate to hit their numbers, churned out whatever would weigh the most or look impressive on paper. One year, a nail factory produced huge spikes too big for any practical use, just to meet its quota by weight. With every level of the planning cascade, the risk of distortion grew. Ministries padded their reports to avoid punishment, while factories hid shortfalls and exaggerated output. This practice, known as storming, meant that production surged at the end of each reporting period, often at the expense of quality. The more ambitious the targets, the more creative the accounting. Data flowed upward, but it was often fiction. Bonuses rewarded overfulfillment, but the system punished honesty. Over time, the numbers looked impressive, but the goods themselves were often useless or defective. Productivity gains stalled as workers and managers focused on fulfilling quotas, not on innovation or efficiency. The Soviet economy became a machine built to satisfy paperwork, not people's needs. Inside the Soviet Union's research institutes, engineers and scientists worked under strict orders to deliver results that matched the plan. But behind the rows of blueprints and official reports, a different reality took shape. In electronics, Soviet designers struggled to keep pace with the West. By the 1970s, their computers lagged a decade or more behind American models. The Ministry of Radio Industry ordered direct copies of IBM machines, yet without access to the latest software or components, the results often fell short. The famous Lada car, introduced in 1970, was already outdated when it rolled off the line. Updates came slowly, and drivers learned to fix engines with homemade tools and spare parts traded among neighbors. As shortages grew, the official economy could not meet daily needs. Ordinary citizens turned to the shadow economy known as the Blatt network. Here, connections mattered more than rubles. A hospital manager might trade extra linens for fresh vegetables. A factory foreman could secure Western jeans or electronics at double or triple the state price. By the early 1980s, this informal system accounted for an estimated 10 to 20% of the country's GDP. Even state enterprises relied on back channels to meet quotas, swapping materials and favors when official supplies ran dry. Innovation became risky. Without profit incentives or private ownership, inventors saw little reward for new ideas. Ministries hoarded advances, fearing blame for failure more than missing out on success. The result was an economy that could mobilize resources on command, but stumbled when asked to adapt or improve. The cracks in the system widened, and every workaround carried the seeds of deeper stagnation. Khrushchev promised a new direction. In 1954, he launched the Virgin Lands campaign, sending thousands of young volunteers to Kazakhstan and Siberia. Over 100 million acres of steppe were plowed and planted with grain. For a few years, harvests soared, trains carried wheat to distant cities, and Khrushchev boasted of feeding the world. But the soil, thin and fragile, soon blew away in dust storms. By the early 1960s, yields collapsed, and the campaign's early promise gave way to disappointment. On the industrial front, Khrushchev tried to break the deadlock of Moscow's ministries. In 1957, he replaced many central ministries with over 100 regional economic councils, Asov Narkozai. The goal was to give local managers more say, hoping they could respond better to shortages and bottlenecks. But the councils often lacked power or expertise. Factories and farms still answered to distant planners, and the tangle of new authorities only added confusion. A few years later, Alexei Kosygin tried another fix. In 1965, he introduced a reform that let enterprises keep some profits and pay bonuses for efficiency. Managers could, in theory, focus on quality and cost, not just raw output. Some factories, like the Shchekino Chemical Combine, used these new rules to raise productivity. But resistance was fierce. Party officials saw profit as a threat to control. By the late 1960s, the experiment was rolled back. The old habits returned. Quotas and central directives came back, and the system rewarded paperwork over performance. Each attempt at reform revealed just how rigid the machinery had become. Oil became the Soviet Union's economic anchor by the early 1970s. In the frozen fields of western Siberia, engineers and geologists unlocked the vast reserves of the Samotlor oil field. By the late 1970s, Samotlor alone was pumping out nearly 3.7 million barrels a day, making it one of the largest oil fields in the world. Tankers carried Soviet crude from Murmansk and Odessa to buyers across Europe and beyond. As global oil prices soared after 1973, hard currency poured into Moscow. By 1980, oil and gas made up more than half of the Soviet Union's export earnings in dollars and marks. These revenues paid for imported food, industrial equipment, and technology the planned economy could not supply. They also provided a financial cushion for the state's sprawling ambitions. Oil technocrats, engineers, planners, and party officials became vital players in the corridors of power, shaping policy and budgets. The flow of petrodollars gave the illusion of stability and progress, even as productivity stalled elsewhere. Underneath the surface, the oil windfall masked deepening inefficiencies and growing dependence. But for a time it kept the system running and the shelves stocked. Military spending became the silent engine of the Soviet economy. By the 1970s, defense absorbed between 10 and 15% of the country's entire output, more than twice the share spent by the United States at the time. For planners in Moscow, security always came first. Factories that built tanks, missiles, and submarines received priority access to steel, electronics, and skilled labor. Consumer goods and housing projects waited in line or made do with leftovers. The arms race with the West demanded constant upgrades, new bombers, faster rockets, and stronger armor. Defense sector managers enjoyed special privileges. From better supplies to higher wages, and their factories rarely faced the shortages common elsewhere. But every ruble spent on weapons meant less for food, clothing, or modern appliances. Supermarkets stood half-empty while military warehouses overflowed. The opportunity cost was enormous. Resources that could have improved daily life were instead locked away behind barbed wire and classified blueprints. As the years passed, this hidden drain grew heavier. The Soviet Union looked strong on paper, but the real price of its military might was paid in everyday shortages and unmet needs. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet economy was running out of room to maneuver. Mikhail Gorbachev, facing mounting shortages and slowing growth, called for a new approach. In 1987, the law on state enterprise granted factories and state farms more autonomy. For the first time in decades, managers could set their own production plans, negotiate contracts, and even sell surplus goods on the open market. The goal was to spark initiative and end the cycle of inflated reports and wasted resources. But old habits were hard to break. Many directors, unsure of the new rules, hesitated to take risks. Others rushed to exploit loopholes, hoarding supplies or striking side deals that left shelves even emptier. At the same time, Gorbachev launched Glasnost, an unprecedented campaign of openness. Newspapers published debates on economic failures. Citizens wrote letters demanding answers for empty stores and crumbling infrastructure. The state could no longer hide the scale of the crisis. As controls loosened, prices began to rise. By 1989, inflation, once a forbidden word, was impossible to ignore. Official prices climbed by double digits, but on the black market, the cost of basics soared even higher. Workers watched their savings evaporate. Factories struggled to pay wages. Public confidence in the system, already fragile, began to collapse. The reforms, meant to save the economy, instead revealed just how deep the problems ran. Each decree exposed more shortages, more inefficiencies, and more voices demanding change. On April 26, 1986, a reactor exploded at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine. Engineers on the night shift struggled to contain the fire as radioactive clouds drifted across the Soviet Union and beyond. Initial reports downplayed the scale, but within days, entire towns were evacuated. Tens of thousands lost their homes. The true economic cost would eventually reach an estimated 200 billion rubles, money the state could not spare. Cleanup workers, called liquidators, faced radiation with little protection. For many, the price was their health or their lives. The disaster exposed not just technical flaws, but the deep rot at the heart of the system. Secrecy, denial, and a chain of command unable to respond to crisis. In the years that followed, the system's last supports gave way. Oil prices collapsed, hard currency reserves dried up, and factories missed even the most basic targets. By late 1991, the Union itself began to unravel. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in a forest outside Minsk and signed the Belavesia Accords, declaring the Soviet Union dissolved. 2 weeks later, on December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president. The red flag came down over the Kremlin. Decades of centralized planning, forced industrialization, and sacrificed generations had ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, irreversible retreat. For engineers, citizens, and leaders alike, the promise of a socialist future faded into memory, leaving behind questions scars, and the shadow of what might have been. Today, Russia still wrestles with the legacy of a system built on command, not consent. As global powers debate the balance between state control and market freedom, the Soviet experiment stands as a cautionary tale. No economy can defy basic incentives forever. The lesson endures. Adaptation, not rigidity, decides who prospers and who fades. What do you think? Are we still ignoring these warnings?